Welcome to Beyond the Shelf. I'm Dawn.
And I'm Jenny. Thanks for joining us. So for this month, Dawn and I each read 3 books that are not necessarily our typical genre that we read. And so we read them and we want to review them for you today.
So we decided to go with the oldest book and then work towards the newest one. So the oldest one that we read is called The Princess and the Goblin. It's by George MacDonald, and this book was published in 1872. So this is before a lot of the fairy tale and fantasy that we would usually know. The start of the genre, in a way.
Yeah, so basically when we chose this book, it kind of fell in the junior high category. Mm-hmm. But it is, like you said, one of the very first fantasy books ever written. Mm-hmm. So what were your thoughts on it, Dawn?
So I'm a big fantasy fan. We know this. And I was just kind of looking up information about George MacDonald, this author, and he's considered to have influenced a whole bunch of fantasy authors. So all of the people that we think of, big names in fantasy, like Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or even Madeleine L'Engle, all influenced by this guy. So these are all authors that I've read and I really enjoy. And so my first thought was this is cute, but it felt familiar to me because it was a lot of princess magic stuff that you recognize in fantasy.
Yeah, it was obviously very rudimentary as far as fantasy goes because it didn't delve in as deep as what we would be used to reading now.
Right.
But I thought it was cute, especially for the age bracket that it falls under. I thought it was cute. The one thing that it did make me think of, because the goblin in this book isn't something about if they have 6 toes, then how did that go? So
the goblins don't have toes.
But if they do, then
somebody in their lineage had married a what did they call
a human?
Them? A human. They had a name for it that was the people from upstairs or whatever they said.
Right.
Yeah.
So because their feet they kind of focused on their feet, it made me kind of think of The Hobbit. So I can see how
Tolkien could have been influenced by these goblins being hobbits. Because the goblins they live underground and they live in caves that they carve out themselves. Now a hobbit's home is much more. What is Tolkien starts The Hobbit with? In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, but not dirty, cold hole, which is more like what the goblins in this book have.
Or even made me think of the dwarves too. So the first line in this book is just, there once was a little princess who, but Mr. Author, why do you always write about princesses? So it kind of goes from there. So I thought it was good. It wouldn't have been a book that I would have just decided to read if we hadn't just chosen this random genre to do. There was a couple of things I felt maybe could have been developed a little bit more. So there's a grandmother that pops up, and she's kind of a hidden or secret grandma. And I didn't feel like she was developed all that well. I don't know if she was
an
just
important part of the plot, but she's not super developed. This is the first in a series, though.
Okay.
So the series is called The Princess and Curdie, and Curdie is the little boy that we meet in this book too. But I'm guessing that in the further stories that the grandma becomes important.
Well, George MacDonald writes a lot of faith-based books. And so I kind of think that the grandma represented to the little girl about stepping out on faith and trusting the grandma, because she kind of leads her basically to where the goblins are and then leads her safely through. So I would recommend reading it if you are new to fantasy. It would be definitely get your feet wet sort of fantasy book.
I could see this as a cute book if you had a younger reader or a pre-reader and it was like a parent reading it together.
Yes.
I could definitely see that as a thing. Because it's got some kind of scary action moments, but something that's not too scary for a younger reader. So this is kind of a middle grade. I would give this book to a 10-year-old.
Yeah, more so than junior high.
Yeah.
For sure. But overall, I liked it. I'm pretty sure I gave it a 4 or 5 on Goodreads.
I think you did.
Yeah.
I was just looking.
Yeah. I probably won't continue with the series.
I want to just because I want to know it kind of leaves off a little bit. And in a way that a lot of books that are in a series do. And personally, I'm okay, so what happens to Curdie next?
Yeah, well, I'll just get the Cliff's Notes from you once you read it.
It might be a while, but
yeah.
I often find myself picking up a book and really enjoying it and then finding out it's part of a series. And then I'm like, oh no, I've gotten into another series that I have to read now.
Yes.
So sometimes I will intentionally be like, oh, that book sounds interesting. Is it part of a series? Do I want to do that right now?
Right. And it kind of depends on the series. Like some you can read and then you can take a long break and get back to and you're fine. Some you're like, oh my gosh, I have got to keep reading and reading. And you're, falling down the rabbit hole of that series for 6 months or whatever.
Right. Don't pick up a series unless you know the author has ended it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But I feel like there's hardly any series that ever definitively comes to an end. It seems like they always find a way to do a prequel or they...
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, even like The Hunger Games had its trilogy. It had its 3 movies. And then they're like, oh, wait, but here's a story about one of the main villains, but when he was younger, and now they're making a movie out of The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes.
Oh, I didn't know they were making a movie out of that. Okay. So, yeah, nothing ever really comes to a conclusion when it comes to books, very rarely, unless, well, even if the author dies, somebody picks it up and keeps going on often.
Agatha Christie, cough, cough.
Yeah. Well, no. Anybody that tries to fill her shoes are just deluding themselves. But well, I mean, look at James Patterson, okay? I mean, he's not dead, obviously, but I don't even know how many of his own books he even writes anymore. Does he even write any anymore? I mean, everything is James Patterson and Bert Smith, they just get his name and then and you can tell when you read a series of his from book to book, you can tell it's a different author because it doesn't have the same flow. But yeah. But anyhow, Princess and the Goblin, I recommend. Do you recommend people to read it?
I would recommend it definitely as a parent and child read together book for sure.
Are you going to call up your mama and read it with her if you continue the series?
My mom would read that book in 10 minutes and be like, that was cute.
Yeah.
And then be done.
It is a short book, so I mean, if you've got a weekend and you're not doing anything and you want to take a couple hours on a Saturday and get through it pretty quick.
Yeah. And read a fun little emerging fantasy book.
Yeah, kind of the beginning. Sure. All right. So the next one is one I know you have a lot to say about.
I have a large amount of notes.
Yes, I have very few notes. I didn't love it. So it's Phantom of the Opera, which was written in 1909. And Gaston Leroux is the author. And this kind of was recommended to us because we wanted to read something in the horror genre. So this isn't what you'd call your typical horror book.
Oh, absolutely not.
I had a hard time trying to find the horror in it. I guess the Phantom was kind of horrific and maybe a little scary. Mostly, he was just so disturbing to me, just disturbing. So I don't know. Maybe if I had listened to it, I did listen to it. Maybe if I had read it, I might have enjoyed it more. Listening to it, I had kind of a hard time following with some of the character changes. It kind of started off stronger. It ended okay. In the middle, it was hard for me to stay engaged.
There was a bunny trail in the middle of this book that I was not familiar with.
Okay. And I didn't really connect with any of the characters. I like to at least connect with at least one character in a book, and I just didn't feel it with this one. But you have a lot to say. You like the movie, too.
So I was introduced to Phantom of the Opera from the, early 2000s musical movie that had Gerard Butler and Emmy Rossum in it. So for me, as I was reading this book, I had the actors from that as the characters for me. Some of it is a little bit different, and obviously because of a film adaptation, they changed things. I don't know if some of the changes were from the original musical and they carried it over into this one or what exactly. But there were a lot of things. The thing about this being a horror book is that it's considered a gothic horror, which is along the same lines as Frankenstein and Dorian Gray.
Yeah.
And that idea comes from what was considered horror in a different time period than now.
Right.
Because for us, when we think horror, we think Stephen King's It.
Yes.
Or the Saw movies or something like that. But for them in that time period, a disfigured human who acts out because of social expectations or lack of socializing, that's a word, that becomes a horror for them. If you think about Dorian Gray, Have you read?
I have. Yeah.
Or Frankenstein. It's really like,
too.
it's a consequences of somebody's actions that have led whoever this character is to behave in this horrible way. The Phantom literally murders people. In fact, in the book, it's described as at one point in time it was like his job. So for that time period, the early 1900s, that was horror.
That makes sense. So what about in the movie? Did he murder people in the movie?
He did. He did. There were some really interesting things to me. In the movie, Madame Giry is like kind of one of the heroes. She's the one who knows about the Phantom's past. And she's like a respected character. But in the book, she's seen as this crazy old lady. I almost took offense for a fictional character. But Madame Giry is like, she's smart and she's witty and she's like the person that Raoul goes to know how to fight the Phantom. I felt like Raoul was so pathetic in the book.
I did too.
And he's like the hero in your musical. He saves Christine and all of this stuff. He's just like this wimpy guy.
Pretty spineless.
Yeah.
And I've never seen the movie. So, yeah, that's what I'm saying. I couldn't connect with any of the characters.
One of the things I did enjoy was the way that Leroux writes a lot of the times. He has some interesting phrases that he says, and I only wrote one down. I think the context of this quote is when they're in like the Phantom's torture chamber, which is kind of being like a desert at the moment, and they're talking about how thirsty the Persian and Raoul who are in there.
I think so, because the Persian kind of like, didn't he like kind of work for the Phantom, sort of? Or was,
in a weird way. Yeah. But when they're talking about like how thirsty they are and thinking about water, one of the ways that Leroux wrote it was, ripple is a word that you feel with your tongue. And I just thought that was like such a cool phrasing. And he just has like some little phrases here and there that I thought was just such an interesting way of writing that you get from, an author. But like, I don't think there's anything else from Gaston Leroux that that's nothing nearly as popular.
So he was
as
a
Phantom.
one-hit wonder.
He was a one-hit wonder.
Well, like I read the first line in The Princess and the Goblin, the first line of Phantom of the Opera is, in which the author of this singular work informs the reader how he acquired the certainty that the opera ghost really existed. I found that a really great first line, and it kind of captivated you, and then I wanted to read more, and then I got kind of disappointed.
Readers of that time period would actually connect that to the actual opera house in Paris, because there was this whole like sort of conspiracy theory that opera house was haunted. And so like Leroux went off of that and just carried it into this whole story.
Yeah, so I take it that you recommend people read the book.
I think if you're a fan of the musical, definitely read the book. There were some differences, like I said, like with Madame Giry, like considering her like a crazy old lady, I was like, how dare you?
So I don't not recommend it. I don't recommend it if you're going in it as thinking you're going to get like a Stephen King horror type movie or a book. I'm sorry, because you're not.
If you like Frankenstein, you would probably like this.
I'm glad I read it, because I do try to read, and I'm sure this probably falls under a classic, a classic novel. And so I do try to read one or two of those a year. And so I can click that off my list. But yeah, so I'm glad I read it. I'm glad it was short.
I've never actually seen it on stage. Like, my experience with the musical is Gerard Butler as the Phantom, which that movie got a lot of like flack because the Phantom is like in no way, not really grotesque.
Okay.
They always talk about, if he takes his mask off and you see his face, like it's going to be so horrible. And like Christine faints when she sees him, but you're like, it looks more like he had some Play-Doh on his forehead. Kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's not as like terrible. If you have
it's like before CGI.
No, not even. Like I was in college, so it was like, I don't know, 2007, 2008 or something like that. Yeah.
So it could have been done better.
They could have if they wanted to, but I think part of it was that they didn't want to make him too grotesque so that, all the girls would still swoon after the Phantom. And then you have to step back and be like, he's the bad guy. He's killed people. Right. Maybe we shouldn't be like, he's so dreamy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is intriguing, the whole story of him, living there. And and people don't really see him. They like there's all kinds of rumors about him, and like he's the one that causes these deaths. And I don't know if he caused all of the deaths that happened or not. If he murdered everybody, I'm not sure. But so like, have you ever like even here in the library or a school or your church, have you ever been in a big building when it's empty and it's just you? And then doesn't your imagination kind of go like, oh, what was that? Somebody just came in, or, you know? And so I think that that's the kind of suspense that this builds.
Yeah. And there's like the mystery that you think of with theaters, because especially in the early 1900s when the theaters like had these whole crews and big production teams, that it almost felt like a catacomb, just with like all the hallways and the rooms and the twists and the turns.
The little trap doors to go off stage and different.
Right.
Yeah.
And for the readers who like are maybe used to attending theater and opera, like all of that behind the scenes stuff is a mystery. And so the idea that there could be like secret places and secret rooms and a moat deep beneath the building, you know, is intriguing.
And it was released in 1909.
Yeah.
So I guess just to give it credit for when it was released and for what it was, definitely. I think that it was, you know, like I said, I'm glad I read it. I would go ahead and tell people it's short, so go ahead and read it. If you don't love it, that's okay. You don't have to read any more books by him because we can't find any anyhow.
I don't know if he wrote anything else, to be honest, so.
As I'm looking at the cover of the book, I'm assuming that's a picture of him.
I assume it is too.
Yeah, because it's just a dude wearing glasses with curly hair and a mustachio and a beard. So I don't think that that's the Phantom, but yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I would put that as the author for sure.
But if you had to compare, like if you had the choice, okay, Dawn, you need to read this book or watch this movie, which one are you going to do?
I would watch the musical because I can recite the whole thing.
Okay, very good. So those were our two books from the 1800s, the 1900s, and now we're going to talk about our one that we chose from 2019. You want to say what it was?
Born a Crime by Trevor Noah.
Now this one I loved.
I did too. I kept telling you, like, it's a really great read, but I didn't want to finish it. So, like, I would, you know, like, read a chapter or a section and then, like, stop.
Yeah.
And I literally didn't finish it until last week because I just didn't want it to end, because the way that he writes is so great. It's informational. You learn things. I learned more about apartheid in South America, or South Africa, than I ever learned in school or from anything else.
I know. I felt the same way because this happened during my lifetime. So, you know, apartheid was happening as I was a child and as I was growing up, and then it ended in 1994, I believe, is when it officially ended. So, you know, I was an adult then, and I started thinking, I'm like, when I was in school, I don't remember learning much about apartheid. Now, granted, history class, my eyes may have glazed over a little bit. Sorry, Mr. Ramsey. But I, you know, I just wasn't a huge history fan. I think I'm enjoying it more now as an adult than I ever did when I was a kid. But yeah, I felt like I learned a whole lot too. And if anybody's listening and doesn't understand what apartheid is, it was basically a system of racial segregation. Started in 1948 through the mid-1990s in South Africa. It was dominated politically, socially, and economically by the minority white population. And it just is amazing to me. And in 1949, this is so important to talk about because of this book. It was the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act in 1949. It was illegal to marry across racial lines or to have an intimate relationship across racial lines. And so that's why this book is called Born a Crime. Trevor Noah, he was literally born a crime. In 1984, it was a crime for him to be born because his father was white and his mother was black. I've got to read the first line of this book, because if this doesn't pull you in to want to read this book, I don't think anything will. The first line of this book is, I was 9 years old when my mother threw me out of a moving car. What?
Hook.
Yeah, you're not going to read that line and just like, put that book away.
Right, yeah.
I know. And it explains why she did it. But
yeah.
It was, this was such a good book, an important book, and I'm so glad that we chose this one to read. This one we chose as a memoir. Unfortunately, Trevor Noah does read this book, but it's only available on Audible. book.com. So it's not available on Libby or Hoopla, because both of us wanted to listen to it because he reads it and he's so funny. You know, he's a comedian now in real life. The book was his real life, but, you know, as an adult, he's a comedian. I really would have liked to have listened to it. I enjoyed reading it. I would really like to listen to it, and maybe sometime if it ever becomes available, I definitely would listen to it again.
I was really impressed with how he like told stories and you learned the history. Like the history was obviously awful, but like the way that he tells it, it becomes interesting and engaging and like funny. I'm just amazed at his own mindset that he had because he wasn't able to, depending on where he was in or around Johannesburg, like he wasn't able to walk next to his father. Yeah. And sometimes he wasn't able to walk next to his mother. Exactly,
because he was too light-skinned to be by her and too dark to be by his dad. And another thing that this book touched on that always rankles me too is there was no police protection for domestic violence at all.
Oh my gosh.
None. Trevor Noah's mother married she never married his father, but she did marry a man who beat her, and she tried calling the police, and I think the neighbors may have, I don't know why if that's in my head, but maybe not, but she did for sure, and they came and talked to the guy, and they're like, buddy, and sometimes you got to put these women in line or whatever.
They literally said to her, like, that would be on his permanent record. Do you really want to file those charges? Yeah. Maybe you should go talk to your husband.
Yeah.
And it's just absolutely devastating, like, that happened, and it became an unsafe place for Trevor to live in.
And his mother, obviously. And he had a younger brother.
He had two younger brothers
that she had with him, too. And it was just it was ugly. And
I just, reading this, it felt like, you know, like he talked about how he had a lonely childhood, but he never felt lonely. He just like adapted and was able to like play by himself and be okay with that in situations that called for it. Like, I feel like it would be very easy to be very depressed about that kind of childhood.
For sure.
But he very much was just like, this is just what I did, and this is how I adapted. And like,
he was a hustler.
He was. Yeah. He definitely was. He was always moving. And I think having that mindset of always moving, and that's what his mother taught him, is one of the things you learn. She taught him that the world was broader because a lot of other kids didn't get that sense. That you were taught, this is how you do math so that you can do this job that you are supposed to do within the confines of the laws of apartheid. And even post-apartheid, people were pushing boundaries, but not that much.
Sure. Well, I think, too, in the Black culture especially, there were times where his mom, I felt like, was pretty abusive to him. But I think, because I don't understand it, I am a white woman grown up basically in a privileged area. You know, I worship where I want to, which, by the way, in the book, they went to 3 churches every Sunday. They went to a black church, a white church, and a colored church. Every Sunday, his mom took him to 3 different churches.
I loved the conversations where he was trying to, like, logic. Yeah. Jesus obviously wants us to stay home today because the car's not working. And his mom's like, nope, this is a test from the devil. We're getting on the bus.
Yeah. And so I can't remember what it was exactly, but he said, I was the fastest black boy in the area, but my mom was fastest black woman. He's like, he would get in trouble and he'd take off running, and she would just run after him to beat him. But it was funny, and it was said in a funny way. And I feel like as he wrote this book, this young man loved his mother.
Absolutely.
And so even though it was borderline kind of beatings that she did, there was always a reason for it. It wasn't just because she had a bad day at work and she decided to beat her child. This was more like, you have got to be in line, because there's going to be people that are not going to accept this behavior, and you could die. You know, so it was, so it's just something that, like I said, we can't totally relate to. We can relate to discipline. I was disciplined, and you were disciplined, and I disciplined my kids. But I didn't have to discipline my kids thinking that if I don't discipline them, they could get arrested for borrowing my car, and spend the night in jail or whatever. That never crossed my mind,
Yeah.
But because I don't want to give away spoilers. Obviously, this is based on this man's life. He, wrote it. But she was a pretty incredible woman. And really, I highly, highly recommend this book. It's Trevor Noah, Born a Crime.
The one that we read is the one that's adapted for young readers, which is It's Trevor Noah, Born a Crime. But if you are just looking for like the quote unquote adult version, the one that is marketed to adults, it's called Born a Crime.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess when I was reserving these, I guess I didn't differentiate
if
between
you search
those.
Born a Crime, like both of them will come up, and then
I can't believe there would be that big of a difference, really.
Yeah, probably not.
I think there was one part that really, he like bootlegged music
yeah.
and sold it, and they would have these block parties, and people would pay like a cover charge to come and listen to them play their music. And there was this one performance that they did at a
the one at the Jewish school.
At a Jewish school.
Are you talking about his friend?
Yeah.
Okay.
His friend's name.
He explained this with like his friend's name.
Yeah.
Because the way that Black people were educated,
right.
they were like taught, they glossed over some history.
Right.
And so he talked about like when people would name their children, they would name them like kind of a white name that anybody could pronounce, and then like a tribal cultural name. So his friend's name, because his friend's parents don't know any better.
Yeah, they named him Hitler. And they went to this Jewish school and were performing this rap, and like his friends were going, "Go Hitler, go Hitler!"
And of course, all of the Jewish students and the faculty are just like,
"What?"
In shock.
Yeah, and so because they didn't know, they just was like, this was just a famous
white guy.
They didn't know,
from
history. Like they could have named him Lincoln or Washington and been saying the same thing. So for them, they did not understand or know who Hitler was.
Right.
And so, and of course the way that Trevor explains it, it comes across as very comical. Obviously it was very serious, but
I think the way that he writes that is just a fantastic example of how apartheid kept Black people uneducated to keep them as like a lower class.
Under the white person's thumb.
Yeah. I thought he made a really fantastic point that like part of the reason that we understand the Holocaust as the atrocity that it was is because there's record of it. But for all of the atrocities that happened in South Africa and across the African continent, there aren't a lot of record of that. We don't know how many people were killed in genocides.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And that's one of the reasons that I really loved this memoir, is because he tells this story that's very comical, and he kind of explains the context in enough of a way that you can understand, like, this is how bad it was for Black people or mixed people or colored people, which were completely different racial groups according to apartheid.
Yeah.
Like, that they wouldn't understand.
But colored people were even above Black people.
Right.
In their hierarchy.
Yeah.
How,
the classes and everything, sure. There was one quote that I did actually write down that I thought was a really concise way to define apartheid. So, like, he talks about the different neighborhoods that everybody lived in and, like, how they were separated racially.
Yeah.
So the quote he says is, "We live in a world where we don't see the ramifications of what we do to others because we don't live with them." And I just thought that, like, that line right there was a really great example of that's why apartheid lasted for, 50 years?
Right. Yeah.
45 years, because, like, people didn't live near each other, so they didn't see how their own actions or lack of actions affected these other people.
Yeah, and you have to admire Trevor's mom, because she did everything she could. She
bucked the system every chance.
Yes.
But she did it, like, in such smart ways, too.
Yeah. I mean, she got a private education for her son. That was very, very rare. It's very interesting how it shows, too, how he never really fit in anywhere. It didn't matter what school he went to. It was, he didn't fit in with the Black people. He didn't fit in with the white people. He didn't even fit in with the colored people sometimes. But like you said, he had such a good, ended up having a really good attitude. And, as a Christian myself, I'm thinking, maybe some of 3 different churches every Sunday might have helped him have a perspective that we maybe we don't understand.
Right. I think that was, like, part of the intention for his mother, too. Like, he talks about how a lot of his Black friends didn't get a chance to see some of the things that he got to see or do some of the things that he got to do. They basically lived their lives in their neighborhood, and they like went to the school that was, you know, underprivileged in their neighborhood. But his mom was like driving him around the city, and taking him to places that like a lot of his friends and some of his classmates never got to see.
Yeah. So the consensus, I believe, between the two of us is read this book.
Absolutely. If you were going to pick one book from the three that we talked about today, 100% Born a Crime by Trevor Noah.
And, you know, have your young adults and your middle grade kids read it too. I don't know what grade level, 12 and up?
Yeah, probably.
12 and up for sure. And it's so good, and it definitely will give good conversations if you read it as a family. I definitely say get it. It's Trevor Noah, Born a Crime. Now, the one thing I haven't done, I was going to do before we recorded and I didn't, was I want to watch his stand-up comedy routine. It is on Netflix, so I'm going to try and still watch that. So this book basically was written kind of like a diary, kind of. So it's like short essays. Yeah. So it does leap around a little bit, but I didn't find it hard to follow.
No. I think
not linear.
It leaped around in some ways in that it would be, you know, he'd talk about when I was this old, this thing happened. But you still, like, got a sense of how old he was or, like, when this was happening in his lifetime.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite stories, too, is that he took the prettiest girl in the school to prom.
Oh, my gosh.
And they had
his friend hooked him up with this girl.
And she didn't speak.
Trevor speaks seven languages, and he did not speak the language that this girl spoke. All she did was just no.
Yeah. So it was just really good.
That was a great story.
And it's not that long either.
No.
So I definitely recommend this one. Actually, I think you should read all three when you get the chance. But if, like Dawn said, if you're only going to pick one, it's Trevor Noah, Born a Crime.
Absolutely.
So good. All right, Dawn, so what do we have coming up in the month of November?
Since we're talking about reading books, on November 9th, the book club is meeting to discuss The Book Woman of Troublesome Creek, 10 a.m., 6:30 p.m. on that day. You don't have to register. It helps if you read the book ahead of time. Just a conversation about that one. And then if you like it, there's a sequel to it called The Book Woman's Daughter. And then we have Teen Book Box registration from the 13th to the 25th. The pickup for that will be in December, but that's just for 6th to 12th graders. They can just tell me what they like to read, and then I'll put some books in a box for them with some treats. On the 16th, we'll have a 3D printing program for teens. So we're going to have a 3D printer here, and we'll kind of get to see how that works.
Are we borrowing that?
We are going to borrow a 3D printer.
And then we will be closed on Thanksgiving Day, which is November 23rd. But we will reopen on Friday, November 24th, and we will be open until 8 that night for Home for the Holidays. So our regular library hours are usually 10 to 6, but Home for the Holidays will start at 5. So from 5 to 8, we'll be Home for the Holidays.
We usually have Santa Claus here.
Yeah, we have carolers out front usually, and the dulcimers are usually here. And sometimes I know the ballet from like the Wayne Center for the Arts has come. And there's just, there's crafts. I know YMCA has done crafts. There's just a whole bunch of different things. And, of course, just around the town, I know that they're going to have the ice sculptures again.
Yes.
And that's been very popular the last couple of years. I hope they stick around longer than till Saturday. They melted so fast last year because
it was like really warm.
And it rained, and so that just kind of did them in. But so Home for the Holidays is November 24th.
I think that wraps it up for us. So thanks for listening. We'll see you at the library soon.